For all their successes, Marvel and DC Comics have not done a good job of representing certain types of people. And on that list are people with disabilities. And so I want to talk about the poor representation of people with disabilities. In the process, I'm going to share with you some of the major issues I see going on and some of the characters I've made that take these things into account and address creating characters with disabilities in a different way. Although Marvel and DC have made a fair number of characters who would fall under the umbrella term disabled, when we look at their heroes, the disabled people are underrepresented. Underrepresentativeness numerically is easy to solve. Just make more characters. So I don't want to dwell on it because it is an easy solution. The harder thing to deal with is the underlying bias related to the creation of those disabled characters. It's not just that they're underrepresented. There's a bias and a misrepresentation going on with the creation of these heroes that kind of goes undiscussed. Daredevil is a great character. Daredevil happens to be blind, so he falls under the umbrella of a disabled character. And if you did a search for top 10 disabled characters, he would be on there. When he lost his vision, he gained an ability that is greater than the ability to see. His radar sense is better than vision. He can see better now. And that's his ability. That's how he came to be a superhero. Dr. Midnight is also blind. He can see in pitch blackness, apparently. And that's his power. And then he's got goggles that make everything pitch black so he can see when it's not pitch black. And so that's his power, is that he's blind but can see better than the sighted people. And so these two people who are both blind but can see better than sighted people, their ability is to see better than sighted people, even though they're blind people. The disability that they have is actually the vector of their power. In a way, neutralizing their disability, it essentially doesn't exist. It's not something they have to deal with. It's gone. And that's not terrible in and of itself. It wouldn't be terrible in a representative world, but given we have so few characters who fall under the umbrella of disabled, that means those two in many ways just aren't. They're not disabled. They're not representative. They're kind of outliers. Cyborg is often listed as a disabled character because, of course, he's lost limbs, but he immediately got replacement limbs. His lack of limbs gave him limbs that are more advantageous than his limbs would have been otherwise. His disability was essentially undone by his cybernetic limbs, and then he became a superhero. Because on top of his disability being undone, he also has abilities as a result of being a cyborg. That representation is again questionable. Thor, for a long time, had an alter ego that had a limp, and when he turned into Thor, it went away. Captain Marvel Jr., Freddy, he used crutches. When he transformed into Captain Marvel Jr., it went away. In all of these characters, there's this constant theme. In some way, they are first brought back to average, and then they become heroes. As though they can't be heroes without first averaging out their disability. And that's the bias. That's the problem inherent with most of the superhero characters you see who fall under the category of disabled. One exception stands out in my memory. That isn't to say there aren't others. There might very well be. But one stands out in my memory of comics I actually read. Silhouette in the New Warriors. She had crutches. I don't remember if she was paraplegic or not. I think she might have been, and maybe had braces that helped her use the crutches. And then she could, I think, phase through things, which was cool. She built in tasers into her crutches, just in case. They just allowed her to have the mobility aid and moved forward. She was just a hero who happened to need crutches. That was awesome. So props on that, but in general, that's not how it goes down. In general, the creator neutralizes the disability, in my opinion, so that they don't have to deal with it. So they don't have to write it, they don't have to think about it, they don't have to draw it. And this is a problem. And then we've got other characters that are beloved characters, very important characters. They get a lot of characterization, they get a lot of effort put into them. People like Professor X, the Chief, Oracle, they're in wheelchairs, it's visible, you can see it, but they're not frontline heroes. Right? They're mentors. They're support roles. No matter how prominent they are, end of the day, they're primarily mentors. They're primarily guides. They're support. They're not the heroes. And it's important that they exist anyway. And I'm not saying get rid of them, but it goes to show that those people, for the most part, whose disability is obvious, it's able to be drawn, it's something that is clear and present, they don't get to be heroes. They only get to be heroes if they can transform into somebody who doesn't have that disability, or they have an ability that vectors through that disability and essentially neutralizes it. They're not allowed to just be that superhero with that disability. Again, there have been exceptions. I don't remember what year, there was a character, Silver Scarab maybe, who was created by a kid who himself was in a wheelchair, and that was pretty cool. And I feel like there was another character who was in a wheelchair who could control little gizmos and devices. But although mainstream, unlike Silver Scarab, the character was part of a team and was really a less important character. Not that that's bad, it's just as a point of representation, it's not glaringly obvious, and I would like stronger representation, so I take mild issue with it. In order to understand and further explore the existence of this bias, what it looks like and how we can deal with it, I think what would be best is to look at two characters that everybody knows, Batman and Superman, and talk about their differences and how this can bring into sharp relief the exact details of this bias. When we look at characters like Batman and Superman, they're characters that are beloved. And they were created in independent comics, right? They were created in worlds that weren't shared. Those worlds only became shared much later. In those later worlds, and especially in present day, when we look at the DC universe, it is filled with characters that have superpowers. We've got Superman. Superman can fly, is invulnerable, is all kinds of things. And then we've got a whole bunch of other characters who also have similar powers, whether it be from alien birth or magic or tech suits or other device or whatever, they're able to fly. Batman can't. Now, most people give that no thought. Nobody seems to have a problem with creating stories where Batman overcomes his inability to fly by doing something else. No one thinks about it, they just do it. It's not a problem. But Superman can fly and Batman can't. By our reckoning, that means Batman's disabled, right? He's not able to do that thing. He can't use flight as a solution to overcoming obstacles. He has to find other ways. Now, we could very easily give him an Iron Man style suit. There's plenty of technology in the DC universe that could do it. He could have literally all of Superman's powers if we wanted to give him that. It'd be really easy. So why not just do that? Why not just give him that to make up for his disability? The character wouldn't be as interesting. The world wouldn't be as diverse. It would ultimately be a bad idea. And besides, Batman is awesome all by himself. He's already capable of superhuman feats. He's just not superpowered. He can do more than what a normal person can do. He is beyond normal because he's a sort of superpowered, non-powered superhero. He's like a supernatural being that is not quite superpowered, but well above normal human, at least in the real world. And he's able to keep up. He's able to make do. He uses different aids, different devices, including mobility aids like motorcycles, cars, and airplanes, in order to compensate for his inability to fly. And creators have no problem with that. They have no problem with somebody who is not disabled but doesn't have superpowers being capable of extraordinary, amazing, and impossible things, things that can't really be done in the real world. They're fine with it. They're fine with finding ways for him to overcome obstacles and solve problems despite his inability to fly, despite the fact that he doesn't have laser vision, right? He's not bulletproof. He's not super fast. He's none of those things. And still they manage to figure out ways for him to be the hero. But if somebody has a disability, even a minor one, all they can do is find a way to erase that disability and then make the person a hero. Why can't they just let them have the disability and be a hero anyway? That's the bias. The belief that the hero starts as average, that they can't be outside of this very limited range of average. They can't be other than that and still get to be a hero. They got to be brought back to average or they don't get to be a hero, or it's too hard to figure out. Yet people have done mental gymnastics for decades trying to find ways to keep Batman from being a guy in an Iron Man style suit. right? They've got to create circumstances to not go down that path because he would just be another guy in a suit, because they need to reinforce the existing character. And yet they won't use that same effort with a character who has a disability. And I find that to be a bias inherent to the industry that I would like to see addressed. Part of the way we address it is how people view disability. When we think about the inability to do something, people often misunderstand it or miscategorize it or categorize the person rather than the ability or inability. And often they're wrong about this. And you can see this bias. Like, for instance, let's say there's a 7-Eleven and somebody wants to go to that 7-Eleven. And on average, most people can just go into the 7-Eleven. You go into the door, everything's great. You buy whatever you're there to buy, and then you leave the 7-Eleven. And that's fine, unless some jackass built stairs in front of it. Now, a bunch of people can't get into 7-Eleven. And it's not people in wheelchairs. That they're on the list. People who utilize wheelchairs are definitely now inconvenienced by these stupid goddamn stairs that didn't need to be there. But so are other people, right? The people with crutches, people with issues in their ankles, in their knees, people who have difficulty in their hips that mean their knees can't be raised too high in the air. Plus, people who don't have any of those issues fall down stairs all of the time. Stairs are dangerous. They are a bad idea for the most part. So normally, people have to find ways to overcome these obstacles. A wheelchair doesn't create the problem if no one built the stairs. A wheelchair is not a disability. A wheelchair is a mobility aid. The Batmobile is a mobility aid. That's it. Our idea of Batman isn't an idea of a person who is disabled, even though, unlike most of the heroes in the entire DC universe, he is disabled. He cannot do any of the superpowered things that most superheroes can do. There are tons of superheroes who have way more abilities than him, but he's not treated as disabled because he overcomes those obstacles with tools and devices and ingenuity. Guess what people with disabilities do on a daily basis? They overcome obstacles using tools and devices and aids and ingenuity. That's what they do. They're basically Batman. And I'm being a little bit of tongue-in-cheek because obviously no one's Batman. Batman is an imaginary character, but you get what I mean, I hope. The bias doesn't need to exist. We can have a lot of characters with varying different kinds of abilities who we create stories and we write and tell stories that involve them overcoming obstacles in different ways. They overcome obstacles that are in consideration of their limitations and ideally take advantage of their strengths and abilities. And that model of finding a way to overcoming your limitations while playing to your strengths says nothing about whether or not the person is disabled. That is simply the structure of a superhero story. And it doesn't matter whether the superhero can or cannot fly. It doesn't matter whether they can or cannot swim, can or cannot breathe underwater, do or do not have heat vision, whether or not they use a wheelchair or not, whether or not they can walk. All of these things are not part of the equation, except to either be under someone's list of limitations or under someone's list of strengths. That's it. Treating them as some kind of trait, or worse, some kind of defect that needs to be corrected, is not accurate. It's not just that it's not representative. It's not just that it's offensive, although it is both of those things. It's that it's also just not accurate. From a storytelling point of view, everyone has limitations. In the real world, from a practical point of view, everyone has limitations. The binary notion of able-disabled is fucking false. It is garbage. It is yet another false binary, like so many of them. The ideas we have around sexuality, the ideas we have around gender, the ideas we have around seemingly everything are these false dichotomies that have been created by lazy people, often encouraged by conservative thinking to make things easier to control, or whatever motive they have. Maybe I'm assuming control, and maybe I'm wrong. But I'm not wrong about the false dichotomies. It's everywhere. It pervades every level of our society, and it is always wrong. They are just lazy descriptions of the world around us that people then take for granted as being gospel. And they're not. They're just laziness. When it comes to human beings of all stripes, everyone has strengths. Everyone has limitations. Everyone has obstacles that they need to overcome. And that's the core of story. That's where narrative lives. It's where the hero's journey is. It's where the hero's arc is. It is the whole point of the story. And if you can't mix up the limitations and abilities of a character and still create a story, then you're just not a very good storyteller. I don't know what else to say to you. So, with that in mind, I would like to introduce you to 3 characters of my own. I have a bunch of worlds that I've created, and in one of them, it's a pretty large superhero world, and I've got something in a little over 100 characters that I've created so far, and my plan is to just release them one character at a time, talk about their backstory, who they are, how they relate to the world, and how I imagine their comic book series is unfolding, kind of an overview of the story that's in my head that I just kind of want to share with people. I want to talk about them, I want to explore them, and maybe get some feedback and start some conversation. So later on, I'll be doing individual spotlights of each character. So the 3 characters I'm about to talk to you about, I'm not going to get into too much detail about them. They will each be in a spotlight in the future. In my world, I've created a bunch of characters who fall under the umbrella term disabled, and I try and keep my world as representative as I reasonably can. And if you look at my other videos and I talk about representation and avoiding tokenism and how to cater to different audiences and how to create characters, those are the kinds of rules I use for my world building, because I want diversity and I want representation, because I want deeper, more engaging stories. I want to challenge myself as a creator and as a storyteller by giving myself more mixtures of limitations and abilities from which to overcome obstacles. I want to engage on more levels of story simultaneously whenever possible. So although I have a bunch of disabled characters to choose from, I wanted to pick 3 very specific characters for a bunch of reasons that I want to get into. First off, I wanted to stick with a hero. I didn't want to go into villains, because if I over-focus on villainous characters, then it might give the impression that I'm suggesting that disabled individuals tend to become villains, which is obviously not true. I touch on that in the meta-narrative of becoming a superhero. So I wanted to focus on heroic characters. I wanted to focus on frontline characters, that is, characters who throw themselves into the action, rather than being support characters or backup characters or reserve characters. I also wanted to be able to easily show differences between them to demonstrate how you can use characters that have a similar disability or a similar limitation, but who overcome that limitation in different ways. I don't just want cookie cutter disabilities, right? I don't just want cookie cutter characters who all solve problems the same way. So I decided on 3 characters who are all heroes, who are all frontliners, and who all rely on a wheelchair, so that you can easily see the differences between how they go about overcoming obstacles given their limitations. So the first character, his name is Freestyle. So imagine Nightwing. I'm a big fan. I like that Nightwing is amazing. I like that we got to see his arc growing up, but mainly I really like how he is a physically amazing character, more so than Batman. When you look at the various proteges of Batman, they tend to be emblematic of certain aspects of Batman, and often ultimately even better than him in their area of focus, even though they're not better than him in the broader categories. And so, given Dick's background, he's a much better acrobat and gymnast than Batman ever was. He is much more physically capable, and part of that is a relaxed, almost laissez-faire comfort that he brings to his physicality. He has a much greater reckless grace that I find very compelling, and a lot of people seem to really enjoy. But the key here is that Nightwing is capable of amazing, near impossible feats of agility and strength. You take a character like that, put him in an ultralight carbon fiber wheelchair, and he would still be capable of amazing, near impossible feats. and that's Freestyle. So you imagine a character like Nightwing who's in this ultralight, designed for extreme sport wheelchair, who is dedicated to fighting crime, who's committed to patrolling the streets and stopping bad guys and doing his thing. And he is a frontline street-level vigilante who relies on gadgets and martial arts and intense gymnastics and agility and strength to do freaking amazing things and throw himself around and fight people. And his wheelchair isn't just a mobility aid. It's part of him. It's part of his training. It's part of how he works. He trains in it. He trains with it. It's with him all the time. It's a part of how he does things. It is part of his martial art. There's no separating it. He's not more or less than Nightwing. He's just different. And he happens to have a wheelchair. And there are advantages to that other characters don't have. And there are limitations as a result of it. It affects his overall story arc. And in his heroic arc, he goes from being a street-level character to one of my more prominent characters as he progresses, as he starts to meet and interact with other heroes. And they begin to, swap stories and help each other out and aid each other in getting better gear and start to form the overall superhero community and grow together. He's one of my prominent characters that I really, really enjoy. Triumph is a brilliant engineer and uses an Iron Man style exosuit as a superhero. Part of his story is that he's actually a member of a team. He's introduced in my Fire in the Hole storyline as a member of a team of guys who they knew each other growing up and they went their separate ways. Back when they were kids, there was an incident that resulted in Triumph requiring a wheelchair, which is sort of part of the decline of their friendship. It's not a cause of it, but it's part of the story of the decline of their friendship when they were younger. They go their separate ways, and now as adults, they've come back together. In general, at the beginning, Triumph starts at a bit of a support character. He works on some technologies in the area of mobility aids. He develops a new way to deal with the energy consumption needs of devices, because that's one of the big problems when it comes to superpowered suits, is the amount of energy they would need in order to do the things they can do. His two friends are doing some hero stuff, and he ends up having to rescue them. And so in that rescuing them, he becomes a hero, which he hadn't really intended to, and finds that he really likes it. And voila, then we've got a hero, and because of the suit, he can of course fly, and he can hover, and the suit being exoskeletal, although he can't move his legs, it can bend his legs to a certain degree to put him in a sort of almost sitting position when he lands, and put out two supporting additional legs that help hold him up to give him almost a seated position that he can hover around in, or if need be, have deployable wheels so that if he lost power, he would still have the ability to be mobile in the suit, just as a final emergency backup. So for him, much like Iron Man or any of the number of exosuited characters, he relies on his technological genius and his powered exosuit to allow him to fly around and overcome any kind of mobility obstacle that a non-flying person would have. And in general, that's Triumph. And number 3 is Night Racer. Night Racer actually began her superhero career as a character called Derby, who was a roller derby inspired superhero. Again, a street level vigilante, much in line with Freestyle, who uses roller skates and sort of a derby apparel, real life superhero type. She ends up partnering with another character who's quite sophisticated technologically. They become good friends. It starts to escalate their game. And then in conflict with a villain, he hits her with a car and severs both of her legs at the thigh. She survives, of course, but loses the legs from essentially just above the knee down, and then is subsequently in a wheelchair. Her and her partner work together to create for her a 4-wheeled motorcycle. And if you were to imagine it, I'd want you to imagine Kaneda's motorcycle from Akira, only instead of one wheel in front, one wheel in back, they're two wheels side by side, just far enough apart that the motorcycle is able to essentially sit upright on its own so that she can ride it without having to put a foot down in order to brace herself, because it's got these wheels that essentially are self-correcting. And the motorcycle itself is designed to change shape. And I don't want to spoil any surprises. And, when I do her spotlight, I'll get into more detail about exactly how it works. The inspiration for it is in part things like Kaneda and Automan, which was a TV show when I was young, and the motorcycles in Tron to a certain extent, and things like that. Plus, in fantasy, things like centaurs, and in Robotech, the motorcycle armored suits that transformed onto people, and Transformers. These kinds of things were the inspiration for this power suit wearing motorcycle driver. And when you're looking at the street level superheroes, when you're looking at Batman and really all the non-powered superheroes, a lot of them use motorcycles. Motorcycles is a very common mobility aid they use to get around. So having her go for that mobility aid seemed to have a lot of utility for me, and I really liked the idea. I like the idea of being sort of attached to the motorcycle to a certain extent and being able to control it as a bit of an extension of your body rather than simply driving the motorcycle. Something more like a centaur. And I like the idea of exploring that concept. And so that's how she overcomes that obstacle. Now, I very quickly glazed over those three characters, and if you're thinking that those characters weren't very good, that's okay. If they piqued your interest a little bit, check back, and I will be doing a spotlight in the future, as I say, on all the characters, and I'll get into a lot more depth. I really wanted to glaze over them and just give you an impression of how they're different, and it's very likely that somebody might think that they're not very good, and that's okay. And maybe they're not. Maybe I'm not very good at this. At the very least, I think it does show how they are different, how they choose different paths to overcome obstacles. Even if you feel I poorly executed it, hopefully at least it stands as demonstrative of the issue I'm discussing. And another reason why I chose these three characters, and a reason why I told you about them the way I did, is to demonstrate another issue that I think creators need to consider when they're working on really any kind of character. And this is just an excellent example type situation to bring this issue into drastic relief, to make it very obvious what I'm talking about. In the three stories I gave you of Freestyle, Triumph, and Night Racer, I didn't tell you how it is that Freestyle came to be in a chair, and I'm not going to. And that's important. Freestyle's story arc does not include that information. His heroic arc has nothing to do with why he's in a chair, whether he was born that way or not, what path he might have traveled through his life to get there, or what emotional journey he took to quote unquote come to terms with it. None of that is his heroic arc. I won't be telling it. And that's important. It's important to know what you should tell and what you shouldn't. To make that as painfully clear as I can, you probably know that Spider-Man's Uncle Ben is dead because it's part of Spider-Man's heroic arc. You probably know that Batman's parents are dead because it's part of Batman's arc. You probably know that Krypton was destroyed because it's part of Superman's arc. What happened to Captain America's parents? I mean, presumably they're dead, but we only know that because he's old. What happened to Black Widow's parents? What happened to Bruce Banner's parents? Think of all the superheroes that there are in the universe. How many of them have backstories where we don't know anything about their parents? Even though chances are every one of them had parents, and given that they're human beings, they probably have a lot of emotional journey they went through as a result of whatever crazy-ass kind of parenting they received. We all have some kind of lingering trauma to some extent or another from our parentage. So why aren't we told about it for those characters? Because it's not part of their heroic arc. It's just background noise for their personhood, but it's not germane to the heroic arc. And we're tuning in for the heroic arc. Freestyle's heroic arc isn't about his wheelchair at all. So I don't tell the story, and I won't. This has a secondary benefit as well. There are people in the audience who are going to empathize with Freestyle. Freestyle is going to be a good surrogate for them. And why not let them fill in their story? Why not let his backstory be closer to theirs than any story I might tell? Why not leave it to their imagination? That's what we do with most characters. We leave backstory elements that are not germane to their heroic arc to the imagination of the audience, so the audience can paint it in however they want, so that they can make the character theirs. With characters that are, in this case, disabled, they're still characters. They're still heroes in my world. So they get the exact same treatment. They get the exact same consideration for what elements of their life are or are not part of their heroic arc and why. It all needs to be considered and it all needs to be answered. And in the case of Freestyle, it's just not part of it. Whatever that was isn't germane to his decision to be a hero or his ability as a hero or what choices he makes as a hero. It just doesn't matter. With Triumph, I did tell you some related things to the fact that he ended up in a wheelchair. But that is also not part of his heroic arc. The only reason I introduced it is because he's a member of a team, and each team member has their own heroic arc, but the team itself has an arc, and that arc began where they were young. And in that story of their youth that was part of their team arc, he ended up in a wheelchair. And so I have to point it out. It's part of that story. But the emotional aftermath, I won't be telling. His journey as an individual after that event is not part of the team arc, and it's not part of his heroic arc, so I won't be getting into it. Although I am introducing pieces of it, I'm not introducing the parts that aren't germane to either the heroic arc or the team arc. So we only know what we know because of that team arc, because of essentially the flashbacks related to the formation of their team and how it harkens back to the earlier days in their life. And it's going to allow them as a team to resolve certain interpersonal issues that they had to allow the team to form. So those interpersonal issues from their youth are a critical story component of the team's arc. So I kind of have to address it, even if it's only tangentially. But I don't have to address any kind of emotional journey that Triumph actually went through, because that's also not part of his heroic arc. His journey to become a hero has more to do with him saving his friends than with any experience he had in his own past. It's about who he is as a person, not what he went through when he was young. We can contrast both of those against Night Racer, where I told you exactly why it is that she is in a wheelchair. Because going from a character called Derby to a character called Night Racer, the choices she's made, why she's using this motorcycle instead of another option. Perhaps she's seeking revenge against the driver of an automobile who created the situation to begin with, and maybe a motorcycle was a good way to do that. Who knows? I mean, I'm not going to reveal too much, but you see how, in her case, the recovery, the emotional journey that might have come from that, is actually part of her heroic journey. Therefore, it gets addressed in the story. Therefore, it's part of her heroic journey. And so this was the final reason why I wanted to highlight these three characters in particular. Each of them has a story. One of them, we don't find out what it is ever. Another one, we only vaguely see it from a distance in flashback and glossed over. And the third, we get to participate sort of step by step. We get to be right there and see this journey unfold. And it's an important lesson, not just about characters with disabilities, but about all characters. And it only becomes more significant the less the character has things that are in common with you. In general, when you're talking about a character that you have a lot in common with, or is like very close to you in type of person, what to say and what not to say for you will almost be instinctive. You'll have just sort of a natural reaction that will be very close to their natural reaction. And so it'll feel like very little work. It's almost like you can do it without thinking. But the more different their lived experience is from your lived experience, the more you have to almost say out loud things about them that they take for granted, that you don't know how to take for granted, because they're not things that are that close to your everyday life. So you say them out loud and you got to think, is this something that this person would share with the world? Is this something that the audience would know or not? And if so, why? Why would the audience know it? There are times when you might have to make reference to certain things so that the audience knows that there's a certain degree of representation going on. And part of that impetus is as a result of the lack of representation in the past. The lack of representation in the past has left a void, and sometimes we need voices to fill that void that can be heard, which means we have to create circumstances for those voices to be heard. We might have to deliberately write some stories that reveal some information so that we know. And if you were creating a superhero world and you had a character and that character relied on a wheelchair and you only had the one, I recommend making that obvious. Right? And when you think about things like, well, if you only have one gay character, maybe you should have a comment about it somewhere. It doesn't have to be central to the character, but let the audience know, only because we don't have enough representation. You know what I mean? That can be a bit of a juggling act, admittedly, but it's something you need to think about. Me, I tend not to think about it honestly, because behind the scenes, I've mapped out all of my character details from their different limitations and abilities, from their different neurological sets, their different sexualities, their different genders. I've got all this stuff laid out and it's very representative, and I've got characters who talk about these traits and characters who don't. Characters where it's part of their arc and characters where it don't. Overall, the world is very representative, so I don't really have to worry about it on a character by character basis because I managed it on a world basis. When you're looking at a company like DC or Marvel, where they already have so many characters, they can't actually deal with that issue on a world basis. Their world's already too large. They have to do it on a character by character basis, which is why you often see them being pressured to do just that, is because really for them, it is the only way for them to make up for the void they already created. They already caused a problem that now they need to do something about. Whereas I'm starting from a 0 point, and because of that privilege of starting from scratch, I'm able to begin with representation. And honestly, it makes my job a little bit easier, and I can be a little bit lazy and a little bit self-indulgent, and pat myself on the back a little bit more than is probably warranted, because I have that privilege of starting from scratch, something that many creators don't. And despite that privilege, I will still be an asshole about other creators. Honestly, I will be a real dick about the lack of representation in comic books and the poor representation and the misrepresentation of different types of characters. And I tend to be a bit of an asshole about it, and I don't really care. But don't get me wrong, I'm aware that I have the privilege of creating in an environment where I have complete control and can just do whatever I want in my imagination. Anyway, that is my walkthrough of essentially how I create characters with disabilities in general. The things I look for, the pitfalls I worry about, the things I'm trying to compensate for. As ever, thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed yourself. If you did, please like, subscribe, do all the things. And as ever, I hope that thought was provoked. If you're still here, go over to biohazardbears.com, check out my little cartoon bears, maybe download some free coloring pages, or check out the ongoing stories every Thursday of the Apocalypse on the Biohazard Bears channel as I sort of unleash the Biohazard Bears on the world and hopefully change the story, and by doing so, change the world.